Hello everyone, apologies for starting this video off with a little bit of an interjection. My streaming software mucked up big time. So I was scheduled to go live and Dr. Constantinou came in and it was all fine. I pressed go live and it said it was streaming and recording and then people couldn't see it. So I had to frantically get another live stream up. I cobbled something together and it's just a hodgepodge of mess. But it's very good content. The only thing that we missed off is the beginning bit, the beginning question where I asked about how she got into theology and things like that. That's the only thing that's missing from this conversation. So what I'll do is I'll read out her qualifications now, like I did at the beginning of the live stream, and then I'll hand it over to past me. So Jeannie Constantinou holds a bachelor's degree in religious studies and a Master of Arts degree in Practical Theology from the University of San Diego. She received a Master of Theology degree from Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology in 1996, where she specialized in Orthodox Theology and Patristics. She also received a Master of Theology from Harvard Divinity School in 1998, where she specialized in the New Testament. She also had previously earned a Juris Doctorate degree from Pepperdine University School of Law and has been a member of the California Bar since that same year. Dr. Constantinou received her PhD at Université Laval, Quebec City, Canada in 2007, writing her doctoral dissertation on Andrew of Caesarea and the Apocalypse in the Ancient Church of the East. Dr. Constantinou has been teaching biblical studies and early Christianity at the University of San Diego since 2002, but she's now retired. Previously, she had taught New Testament at the Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology. She has led Bible studies, taught and lectured on the Bible and Orthodoxy at parishes, conferences, retreats and seminars for over 30 years. So, without further ado, I hand over to my past me and we'll pick up where we resumed or left off. Also as well, please do forgive any changes in picture and things like that. It was a real mess. I really do apologize. The audio is good though, so please do enjoy. Without further ado, Dr. Constantinou, everyone, back for the second time for everyone to view. We're all good. Right, okay, so moving on to the second question. So you shared a little bit about your personal journey and what led you into theology and things like that. So how would you describe the distinctive features of Orthodox theology, especially in comparison to other Christian traditions? Like what's the sort of, what makes Orthodoxy Orthodoxy?
Yes. I think that we can distill that down to one word, and the word is tradition. And it is something that what we mean by that is different from what others think that word means or what it means to them. And so for us, when we say tradition, we're talking about this consistency and continuity with the past without changing it in a significant manner, without adding to it, without taking things away. So when Catholics say that they have apostolic tradition and they sincerely believe that they do, they don't mean by it what we mean. When we say we're following apostolic tradition, we're saying that we're keeping what the early church received from the apostles. Now, we need to make a distinction between the primitive church and the early church. The primitive church, we're talking about the first few decades when the apostles were literally alive. But then, of course, the church began to settle in, and there were certain, especially liturgical standardizations that took place very, very early on in the life of the church, and certain structures that were created. For example, we didn't have an office of a bishop separate from that of a presbyter initially. But by the end of the first century, we see that a city has one bishop and many presbyters. Originally, those terms were interchangeable. So within a couple hundred years, the church really settled in and had a way of doing things and a way of structuring itself. It understood its theology. The things stopped changing. They stopped developing from that very primitive period. into a more organized church. But after that, certainly by the year 400, the church that we have at that time, the first 4 centuries, is the church of the Orthodoxy today, with relatively little changes. So when we talk about following tradition, that's what we mean. When Catholics say that they have apostolic tradition, what they really mean is that they have a pope, and it is the pope who preserves apostolic tradition. So if the pope says, this is the teaching of the church, and it's something the early church never heard of, never even imagined, nonetheless, they consider that apostolic because they believe that the pope stands in the role of St. Peter. So that's a very different thing. So Catholics use apostolic tradition in a way to justify the changes that they have created. That's very, very different than what we mean by it. You understand what I'm saying? So Protestants, of course, protested against the Catholic Church and the changes, the innovations, the papacy, all of those other doodads and adds-ons and purgatory and indulgences and all the things that they protested against, that the Catholics called tradition. And the Catholics use the word tradition to justify all of those changes that they made. So the Protestants need to understand that when we say tradition, we don't mean all the additional things that never existed in the era of the early church, but are justified because of what the Pope says. So what really distinguishes Orthodoxy is that tradition in the sense of fidelity to what the early church believed, and especially how the early church lived and thought. That's been lost in the West. But this is very hard to explain, because when people are looking at different religions, they're comparing, right? These people have Mary clergy, these people do not. These people have sacraments, we do not. They're looking at these externals, but the externals are not really where the difference lies. The difference lies with why we have those differences in the first place. Why do Catholics have these additional doctrines and the Orthodox do not? Why do the Protestants reject Catholic doctrines? And because of that, they tend to reject Orthodoxy too, because they just assume that we mean the same thing by it, you know. So that's what I would say. The distinctive, there's really one distinctive feature of Orthodoxy, and that is tradition. But by that meaning timelessness, constancy, and continuity with the past, and a tremendous reluctance to innovate or accept any changes.
Great stuff. Yeah, fantastic. I mean, and that's what I think Orthodoxy is incredibly, I think in a way it's incredibly raw. Like it's a very raw sort of almost, I don't want to use the word primal, but it has that sort of sense of it feels like a genuine connection to the past, and like,
yeah,
for me anyway.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's true. And Orthodox Christians experience that, and that's important to them. And I think that is more of an intellectual concept for other Christians. They know they're connected to Christians in the past, but we really feel it. We feel that we experience it. We read the same writings that they read. We say the same prayers that they said. We sing the same hymns that they sang. You know, we feel a very strong connection to the early church in a very real sense. It's not imaginary or, sort of figurative connection, but in a very, very real sense. And in addition to that, I think we feel a responsibility to them to maintain what they died for, what they suffered for, what they sacrificed for. And it's very, very strong in Orthodoxy. And we take that very seriously. And I would say for others, especially among Catholics, who tend to see, let's say the papacy and the magisterium, those are the bishops of the church, as responsible for preserving the faith and just proclaiming what is correct Catholic faith, they also say that the faithful are responsible for preserving the faith. And I'm not saying that they don't really believe that, but they don't see it the way we see it. We take that very seriously. And the Orthodox, on a very personal level, each person feels responsible for preserving the faith. Any serious Orthodox Christian does.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I would agree with you, and I think that's what makes it so beautiful. Is you have that connection. I mean, whenever I talk to people about, because I'm going through my catechism, I'm a catechumen into the Orthodox Church, and I sort of have this sort of, the way I describe it to people is, I just like the woman who was bleeding. All she wanted to do is reach out and touch the hem of Jesus's garment, right? And she had faith that she'd be healed. And all I want to do is, I just want to reach back through history and just touch the hem of Jesus's garment, and to pray how the disciples prayed, and to believe what the disciples believed, and understand what the disciples taught, and go back to that root of Christianity.
Yes, that rooted. And so what you're described as raw, or primitive, almost, it is that sense that, but I don't think any other form of Christianity has that sense, that because we know, we can see that because we see it in our prayers and in the services and in the manner of life, that this is apostolic. And there's no doubt about that, because we can read the earliest Christian writings, and they sound exactly like any one of us would talk today, or what we would read in a contemporary Orthodox book today. It really hasn't changed. And I think the reason why most other Christians don't really understand that or respect it is because they don't understand what we mean by tradition. It's not just like, oh, well, this is something we do because, this is what our grandparents did. It's not just like a sentimental thing. It's a connectivity that is in a very direct, a very palpable, and you just can't convey that in words, and nobody can really understand it if they don't live it. So there was somebody who said something once about Orthodoxy, which is just so good and so perfect. And they said, when you're outside of it, you can't understand it. And when you're inside it, you can't explain it. And that's true, because it's not about everything being up here and you can't articulate it. It's an experience, but it's a very deep and profound one.
Yes, exactly. So moving on to your obviously going into sort of the way, you were a teacher, lecturer, you do your live program as well, where you dive into the text and you take questions from people and things like that, search the scriptures. I highly recommend that program to anyone who enjoys Dr. Constantinou's comments so far. Brilliant, very deep, very profound, and phenomenal work. But what are some of the most significant challenges that you personally have faced in teaching the Bible from a Orthodox perspective, and perhaps, maybe even shed a little bit of light as to what it was like lecturing as a Orthodox Christian in a Catholic university?
That's true. It's interesting. That's a very interesting question. So we'll start with that one. I felt very blessed that nobody ever told me what to say in my class. And whenever I was invited someplace else to speak, I remember I got invited to a couple of times as Catholic Biblical Institute. And I said, well, why are you asking me? I said, I'm an Orthodox Christian? Yes. I said, well, I'm going to teach it the way that I would teach anyone. And actually, one time I taught at a public university, it's very well known here in San Diego, the University of California at San Diego. It's a big institution. They have a medical school and everything. And we were, that particular semester or quarter, I was teaching the Gospel of John. I didn't teach there a lot, but this was very interesting because I had almost no Catholics in the class and one Muslim student. And the Gospel of John really emphasizes the divinity of Jesus. And I thought to myself, because she was very Muslim, she had a hijab and everything. Her name was Muslima, lovely young lady. I said, how am I going to teach this class? Because you don't want to say things that are offensive to someone, but at the same time, I always, whether it was the podcast or the classroom, I can only teach what I actually believe. I'm never going to say something I don't believe or couch what I say. The only time I would ever do that is if I knew that there were Jewish students in the class, then I would not say the divine name. I tried not to say the divine name, Yahweh. I would try, because that's really very upsetting for them. But other than that, I would just teach as I always taught. So I did that. I said, look, I don't know how she's going to react to what I say about Jesus Christ in this class. Things like the Father and I are one, talking about the Trinity and things like this. But I'm just going to do it as I always do. And what was interesting was at the end of the class, she thanked me because she said that was the first time she ever understood what Christians really believed. Because prior to that, as a Muslim, people were always afraid to tell her what Christians really believe. Oh, we believe, Jesus is a prophet. They kind of tried to minimize the differences. Well, there are huge differences between saying Jesus is a prophet, Jesus is the Son of God, the actual Son of God. So that was a very good lesson for me to remind me that, and I think it's good for all of us, that people really want to know the truth, or at least they respect where you stand. So in my classes, I always did that. I had atheists, I had Buddhists, I had Muslims, I had Hindus, I had every conceivable kind of student. Even though it was a Catholic university, less than half of the students were Catholics themselves. So I just taught the scriptures primarily from a historical perspective, depending upon the class, of course. If it was Introduction to the Bible, I talked to them about what Bible manuscripts are like, where they're housed. They learned about Abraham. We talked about Genesis, the language in Genesis and creation, and is it in conflict with science? In other words, it wasn't like a preachy religious kind of thing, but mostly a historical perspective. Who is Abraham? When did he live? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. They go to Egypt. They come out of Egypt under Moses. They enter the Promised Land. David becomes the king, and They had to know all that history. So I taught it primarily as a history course, and then within that, every class, every story in the Bible has a great lesson. This is one of the great things about the Bible. This is why it has stood the test of time. This is why the Bible is the book that has the most copies throughout the world. It has been translated into more languages than any other book in the world. And because the stories have profound meaning and everybody can relate to them. There isn't a perfect person in the Bible at all, except for Jesus. And even with these very flawed people, somehow they encounter God, and God uses them for some wonderful purpose, So it's just a phenomenal book that way. So that's how I would teach the course. And then students can get a lesson out of it. I never asked them in class, what do you think or what do you believe? I always felt that was, first of all, you can't grade a person on that. So I never did that. I wanted them to learn the history and some of those technical aspects of biblical studies. But then the rest of the time, I was hoping that they would think about the stories and apply them to their own life. And I think a lot of people did. So that's what I was doing with the undergrads. And then as an Orthodox Christian, I don't think it affected me too much, except that there were things that I would never say. There were other students, had other professors who would say things like, oh, this never happened. Jesus didn't really change the water into wine. I know that there are professors who said those kinds of things. Or Jesus didn't really say these things from the cross. He didn't really feed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread. So they would say that, and that was disturbing to students, especially the students of faith. And they would ask me what I thought about that, and I would answer them, and I don't agree with that. But the trend in biblical studies and in the universities is to treat miracles as though they're, one professor called them Harry Potter. That's the term that she used for the miracles in the Bible, which is pretty reprehensible for a Catholic theologian. But that's what they think. So students, I found, of all kinds, were hungry for a person who is at least marginally intelligent, who can even be a lawyer, let's say, which I was already for that time, and still actually be a person of faith. I think it gave them a hope that they can also have faith and be a person in modern society, and an intelligent person who functions in modern society. And there are a lot of us, by the way, including many scientists, but people don't hear about that because no one wants to talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's sort of, that's very much a very lived-in experience for a lot of Christians nowadays, because all society wants to do is to rip their faith from under their feet.
Right. The way that we can stop that is by starting to speak up more. And we shouldn't be intimidated. Not to pick a fight, but to say, yes, I'm a Christian, and so what? What's it to you? Yeah. Yes, I believe that. What proof do you have that these things didn't happen? Why don't you prove that there wasn't a Jesus, or that these things? As a matter of fact, if you really look at the Bible objectively, it's much more likely that these things happened than didn't happen. And we know much more, the Gospels are much more credible than a lot of things that we accept, that we hardly know anything. We hardly know anything at all about Alexander the Great. Yet nobody questions the history that's written about him. Nobody questions Moses. Nobody questions a whole lot of things for which we have much less evidence. You know this because you told me you read my book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, and I talk about this. But everybody treats the Bible as, because it's a religious composition, they treat it as though it cannot be factual. And that's not true, because because they're continuing to do archaeological digs in the Holy Land. And the fact is that archaeology has consistently proven the truth of the Bible. It's not worked the other way. Everybody assumed that once we really start digging, we're going to find out that these are all fairy tales, but they've been wrong. Everything that has been said to have been a myth. There was no such thing as David. For a long time, people said David is such a model king. He's a model king in the Bible, the person every other king is compared to. So they said there was no real David. He's this mythical, idealized figure of a king, until they actually found evidence that there was a king, a kingdom of David, archaeological evidence of that. And it's hard to find evidence in the Holy Land because it's buried under, underneath Jerusalem, most of it.
Yeah. Well, also, there's King Nebuchadnezzar as well, where, didn't realize that he was, they didn't even think he was a real king or things like that. And then it wasn't until they found stamps with his actual physical inscription on King Nebuchadnezzar am I.
There you go. Well, there's so many stories like that. And people just assume that the Bible is a bunch of fairy tales. But consistently, every year, there's lots of little discoveries that most people don't hear about that confirm the details in the Bible. Discoveries that are made that we didn't know about not so long ago, like the pool of Siloam, where Jesus healed the blind man, the man born blind, in the Gospel of John. That was discovered only a few years ago. Hezekiah's tunnel, quite a few things continue to be discovered. And the truth of the Bible is confirmed. It's not disproven. So, but of course, once they find something, they'll say, oh, that's nice. That doesn't matter. They just ignore it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't think we should care. I personally don't think we should care. We should just speak the truth and let people believe or not believe.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the freedom of choice that God gives us. You know,
That's right.
he allows us to choose whether to accept or reject him, and we choose
That's
our
right.
own path as a result. And you
That's
know,
right.
it's ultimately up to us to seek out God, and
Hmm.
God has put institutions and structures in place so that we can do that. He has established his church on earth. If you have questions about theology, if you have questions
Yes.
about God and how to worship, how to pray, how to read scripture, go to his church. He's
Mhm.
established a way to connect with us.
That's true. That's true. That's a very beautiful explanation of what the church is. A way on earth for living human beings to connect to God. That's exactly right. Very good.
Yeah.
Very well said.
So moving on, the writings of the church fathers are are quite critical in Orthodox Christianity.
Yes.
How can modern Christians learn from them in a way that is relevant in the here and now?
Well, I think that they never, like most things having to do with tradition and orthodoxy, it's always relevant. And whatever they say, I think you will find impacts us the same as it did people 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, because they're talking about spiritual things and our struggles as human beings to overcome our weaknesses, and that never changes. That has never changed. So that's I think that they're always relevant. What people choose to read kind of depends, and of course, a lot of people think that fathers means ancient, but not necessarily. We do have fathers of the ancient church, of the golden age of the fathers, which is the 4th century. And then we have fathers from the 8th and 9th and 10th centuries, and if even from the 20th century. So we have fathers from all eras in the Orthodox Church. We accept anybody, and it's not, antiquity is not a requirement, but he has to be someone who has preserved the Orthodox faith, has preserved apostolic tradition, who is consistent in what he says with what the early church always taught. And if you read that, anyone that you read, it's going to be something that really speaks to you. Although sometimes we have some that we can relate to, better than others. There are spiritual writings on prayer. There are biblical commentaries. Sometimes there are letters, and those can be interesting of one person to another. There are other types of treatises. And there are also spiritual works that are giving advice for handling issues and passions that afflict us, or what to do about dreams or demonic possession or temptations or all kinds of things. So there's so many different types of writings. And I don't think we have to try to figure out how they're relevant. They're always relevant because they have to do with the spiritual life.
Yeah.
And humans are the same as they always were.
Yeah. It's the same battles that they faced back in the
Exactly.
day, but
It's just like the Bible.
yeah, it's the same it's the same pig but different mud.
That's true. But look at it. Are we sinning in any really new way? Is there some brand new sin that's been devised? I mean, maybe we have technology today to deliver sin more efficiently. You don't have to go to an X-rated movie theater like you used to have to do if you wanted to watch pornography. In the 1960s, you had to go to a special movie theater. Now you just turn on your phone and you get it, but it's still the same thing. And it's not that they didn't have that in antiquity. They had that too. They had everything that we have today, the same kinds of sins. So, we just have, it's more accessible perhaps for us.
Yeah.
But you still have the same battles, the same spiritual battles.
Great stuff. I'd love to move on to your phenomenal book, Thinking Orthodox, which I have a copy here, which I can hold up for the camera so people can see what it looks like. Fantastic. So in Thinking Orthodox, you introduce the concept of the Phronema, okay? And could you just sort of help illuminate those who in our audience who might not be Orthodox or may not even have heard of the Phronema before? So could you just describe what the Phronema and why is it so
Sure.
critical to the Orthodox faith?
Okay. Phronema is a Greek word that means the combination of thought plus action. It is translated into English in a wide variety of ways. It can mean worldview, your mentality, your mindset. That's that type of a thing. We all understand what it is to have let's say, a pessimistic mentality versus an optimistic mentality. We all understand what a worldview is. Everybody has a phronema. Everybody has a worldview. Everybody has an attitude. But our attitude impacts our actions. How we live, the way we think impacts the choices that we make our life, and vice versa. The choices that we make, reflect on us and sort of reinforce our thinking. So it's that intersection between thought and behavior that phronema is talking about. And it is also a biblical word. It's an ancient Greek word, but it's something that was understood by the Greek philosophers, and they used it to talk about this idea of behavior and mentality going together. So that's in the Bible as well, understandably, because the gospel writers wrote in Greek, and St. Paul was a Jew living in a Greek world, and he used that term also to speak about the way Christians think. And so for Orthodox Christians, we have a unique phronema among Christians. It's the phronema, the mentality of the early church. It is what Jesus Christ instilled in the apostles. Now, most people don't really think about that. I think, especially now with this TV show, The Chosen, people were getting all kinds of ideas about what it was like when the disciples were following the Lord. I was just watching, people ask me about that show all the time, and I don't watch it. So I said, I better watch at least a few episodes to see what people are talking about. Well, I was watching it last night. It's not all bad, but there are many places where I was laughing. Okay, because, for example, they were so, I don't even know where they were in the story. But they were sleeping on little beds. They were like sharing a room that they stopped in, and everybody had a bed. And I'm like, that's not going to happen. People were sleeping on the floor. Okay, they weren't sleeping in little individual twin beds. This kind of a thing. So if you don't understand the mentality of the early church, you do not understand the New Testament. So I'm not talking about these historical details that they got wrong. But you have to understand that the church had a worldview that was different from everyone else in the world. And I don't think we give those first Christians nearly enough credit for being brave enough to believe in Jesus Christ, because everyone else in the world was a pagan. That means they worshiped idols, and they were immoral, or they were a Jew, and that meant that they, had very strict rules about ritual purity. There was no such thing as Christianity. This is something brand new, and they had to learn to think differently, and they acquired that different mentality from Christ through the apostles. Now, what's the different mentality besides the fact that we never sacrificed animals and things like this? Just think about the fact that in antiquity, what the most important thing for a human being was respect, to be respected, to have glory and honor. And this is why St. Paul talks about glory and honor so often in the book of Romans. Glory and honor to the Jew and also to the Greek, because you wanted to be respected in society. You wanted people to speak well of you. This is why people gave money so that fountains would be built and they put their names on it. That was very important, to be respected. And here you are saying that your Messiah, this person that you worship as God, died on a cross. So to decide, and so Jesus is saying, don't seek after worldly honors. Don't look for respect. Don't look for glory. Don't seek after money. Choose a life of service. Wash each other's feet. that's pretty shocking. So the mentality of the Lord to emphasize humility and love and self-sacrifice over worldly honors and glory and money and fame and reputation was a complete shift, both for the Jews and for pagans. We don't remember or realize that. So the church had to really change the way people thought. And they instilled this phronema of the Lord from the apostles into the first believers, and this is what they passed along. So the Christian faith was not just a set of concepts. They didn't say, do you believe in Jesus? Yeah, I believe in Jesus. Okay, you're baptized. Congratulations, you're a Christian now. Figure out the rest for yourself. It wasn't like that. They joined a community and they learned a different way of thinking. And we're so accustomed to the teachings of the gospel that we don't really realize how radically different that was from the rest of society. And so we have to learn that. So Orthodox Church has that phronema. Now, in terms of values, other Christians also, they understand these things. Love and humility and self-sacrifice, they understand these things. But what Orthodoxy has in terms of its mentality that everyone else has lost is the understanding that we cannot understand God or decide theological matters based on our human deductive reasoning. That's what Orthodoxy has preserved from the early church that Protestants and Catholics have dropped a long time ago. So they still try to answer questions about God using their brains, and the church never did that. And Orthodoxy has preserved this reluctance to talk about God, especially about things that we cannot know or explain, and an absolute reluctance to use human reasoning to come up with answers to theological questions. So I don't know if I answered the right thing.
No, that's fantastic. No, that's great. I think, you've touched upon that that idea of, how radical it was. Well,
Yes.
no, it wasn't necessarily an idea. It's a fact. It's a fact. I think, that's even more true today.
It is true today. I'm glad you brought that up.
Because we have this society that's obsessed with the worship of self and self-improvement, self-image and things. Yeah.
Self-image, self-improvement, fame. I mean, TikTok, YouTube, it's all about clicks and likes and people approving of you. And, that is exactly right. We have returned to that first century mentality in which people think the most important thing is to look good, have people like you, be wealthy and successful. And so the values that our society currently expounds are really not Christian values. They are very much like ancient Rome, frankly. It's true.
Yeah. No, that's very true. Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, I think we're much worse than the Romans are. I used to think, I think we're almost as bad as the Romans. I think we're much worse than the Romans because the Romans respected their gods. They respected their gods. They did nothing without consulting the gods, without offering a prayer or sacrifice to the gods. We don't care about God. We just say, God, go here in the corner, stay there, because I don't need you right now. Okay? Don't bother me with all that stuff about sacrifice and, humility. I'll worry about that later. Right now I want to be rich and beautiful and have a nice car. And, we have 18-year-olds getting Botox and unbelievable stuff. People care about these things that have absolutely no real value. And we're all going to die. We're going to have to answer for this. And the way we spend our money, I'm guilty of this too. I have a closet full of clothes upstairs. So, St. Basil said, if you have 2 garments and somebody else doesn't have one, you're responsible to give. That's what Jesus said, right? And he's naked. That's your fault. And he's right. That's the real Christian legacy. And we kind of forgot about that. We've become very very superficial Christians, unfortunately. But if we really lived like Christians, we would change the world.
Yeah.
People look at, have you heard about this? You know, you hear the young people today, oh, I want to be a change maker. I want to change the world. They're starting companies and they want to have a social purpose. You know what? Change yourself and you change the world. That's really true. But Muslims don't want it because we're too comfortable. We like our lives the way they are. You know, we don't want to really sacrifice.
It's like they want they want the butterfly effect, but without the butterfly.
That's true. That's exactly right.
Yeah, but yeah, no, I mean, I think, you know, and especially now, you know, and again, you touched on the idea of, you know, we are basically, you know, we have gotten even worse than ancient Rome.
Yes, I think so.
And we're even seeing that within the church now with progressive Christianity introducing all of these, you know, oh, it's fine to be yourself and you can be what you want, and you can chop and change and do all this stuff. And it's, I think, you know, this is a deliberate attack on by the enemy to
absolutely and
undermine the what's the word I'm looking for, the rock and the
that's right.
You know, the firm foundations that Christ established.
That's right. And what the enemy has that he didn't have before is the Christian teachings. The Romans poo-pooed the Christian faith. They thought it was ridiculous. They mocked it. But because most of society today identifies as Christian, even though they don't really seem to understand what that means, or they don't want to live according to the reality of the Christian faith, now they take the words of Christ and use it against those who are really trying to live a Christian life. You know, things like judge not lest ye be judged. Well, you're judging. You can't say that thus and such a thing is a sin because you're judging. Or they take Jesus and they use him, but they transform him into this kind of a wishy-washy milquetoast figure who never said anything controversial, never hurt anybody's feelings. Like the very worst thing you could do is hurt somebody's feelings, you know. So now the devil has the Christian faith and he's using it against the church. He's using the teachings of Christ against the church. I think very effectively.
Yeah, and especially in the last sort of 4 years, there's been a rush back to proper, you know, apostolic faith. People are leaving these churches of progressive Christianity. I see stories online of people who just got sick and tired of and fed up of just not being spiritually fed.
Yes. I think that's the main thing. They realize that there's something missing. It's like, you know, if you were, you know, hungry and all you found were potato chips and cupcakes, they would taste good at the moment, but you still feel hungry after you eat them because there's nothing of nutritional value there. So it's so sad when we see these wonderful ancient churches, you know, the Catholic faith that had its own ancient tradition, its own ancient Latin spirituality and prayers, and they have abandoned that, and they're just chasing after modernity. Or even in the Anglican tradition, such a beautiful tradition, a liturgical tradition, a beautiful musical tradition. Even when you listen to, you can take something like Handel's Messiah. My gosh, it's a whole story of salvation. And every word is right out of the Bible. And today, what do we get at Christmas time? We used to sing Christmas carols, and the carols had real theological content. And now we have, you know, all I want for Christmas is you. Christmas has become a period of romance, you know, or it's Jingle Bells and Rudolph and Santa Claus. And we can really see how it's been trivialized by the culture and made into something that it really never was, rather than celebrating the incarnation of the Son of God and thinking about what that means. It's become just a holiday to spend money and have a day off, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly.
So all of the churches, all Christian churches used to have these things in common. When I was young, all churches believed basically the same Christian, rock solid, this is who we are. We believe in the Trinity, the incarnation, the virgin birth, the resurrection, the crucifixion, the second coming, that these things are sins. Nobody disagreed about what was a sin. And everybody knew, even if they weren't a faithful Christian, they would never say, oh, that's not a sin. They'd say, yeah, I don't do that, or I commit this sin. But they wouldn't argue with you and say it's not a sin. Now, that's all changed. Now they want to appropriate the Christian faith and use it to promote sin. That's what's changed.
And I think this echoes what we should be as representatives of the body of Christ on earth, is being lights in the darkness, being the lighthouse to beckon people to safety in amongst all this chaos. And for me personally, that's what the Orthodox Church is. It's a clear, rock solid lighthouse to guide people back to what Christ taught, black and white, yes and no. Here you go. Believe.
Yes, that's right. Here's your option. This is what it is. Believe or not believe, but it's your choice. But at the same time, it's not done in an authoritarian manner.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think this is what distinguishes Orthodoxy, let's say, from the Catholic Church, where they will say, this is what you're obligated to believe. This is how many times a year you must do this. These are the days you're obligated to go to Mass. We never present the faith in this way. We say, here it is. You want it? Go ahead. Start living this way. But it's never authoritarian in Orthodoxy. And that's very, very different. So even though we could say, extremely rigid about certain things, we're rigid when it comes to doctrine. We're never going to compromise on that. We're never going to change that. When it comes to how you live the faith, there are very few really hard and fast rules. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have guidelines, but nobody imposes them and nobody says everybody has to do this. Instead, it's like, where are you in your personal walk? You talk about it with your parish priest. He says, this is what I think you should be reading. This is what I think you should be fasting from. This is what I think. Looking at you as an individual. And it's so different, than what we see in some of the Western churches where, in order to be saved, everybody's got to do this. You say the sinner's prayer, accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, speaking in tongues, whatever it is, everybody else has something that everybody has to do. And for us, it's about that slow process of getting to know God, of spiritual growth and maturation. And this is also something which may frustrate some people coming to Orthodoxy. There's no quick, suddenly you're holy. You can never say I've made it. You can never rest and say, I don't have anything to worry about. I've got it all figured out. I've figured it all out in my head. It's just not that easy. Orthodoxy is honest in that way. It's honest in a way that other churches, they think they're honest. I'm not accusing them of trying to be deceptive, but they really believe that they've figured it all out. They've come up with a formula. This is what you do. And you do this and you're going to go to heaven. And the early church never said anything like that. Jesus never said anything like that. He had so many different things he said that we need to do. And so Orthodoxy just doesn't give you an easy answer. And it doesn't give you easy excuses. There are no excuses. Yeah. You stand and fall on your own.
Yeah. And I think also as well, talking about the sort of the hard and fast rules of things, that harkens back to the early church under persecution, where it wasn't, oh, you need to do this on a Sunday, you need to do this, you need to do that, X, Y, and Z, you need to go this amount of times, X, Y, and Z. They couldn't.
Yes.
If they were under persecution, they couldn't, right. They didn't have the freedom to do that. They had to do what they could when they could.
That's right. But the standards were not minimized. And that's the important thing when you really look at it. So one of the courses I taught practically every year when I was at the university was called Early Christianity. And I didn't believe in it. I never had textbooks. I had students read the text itself. And that was, we just read these different writings from the first 4 centuries of the church. And one of them is a very famous manual of Christian belief called the Didache. And it was one of the earliest, it is the earliest, the single earliest Christian document that did not end up in the New Testament. And it lists all of these things. Do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. The first half of it is all like this. And students get overwhelmed by that. But the standards that Christians held themselves to was very high. The standards were very high. But then there's this little sentence there in the Didache. It says, if you can't do this, do what you can. That's the key.
Yeah.
So we don't look for reasons to say, well, I can't do this, and therefore I'm off the hook, or I need dispensation from fulfilling this rule or this law. It's like, this is what it is. Do what you can, but you have to be honest with yourself. If you're looking for some reason to have an excuse not to do it, God is not mocked. God will know whether or not you honestly couldn't do it because you were ill or pregnant or whatever, or because we were just looking for an excuse. So again, it's not because God expects us to follow rules, but all of these things are opportunities for us to learn self-discipline so that we can be faithful to Christ when we're really seriously tempted by something important, really a major temptation. If we don't practice on the little things, we're never going to be able to do the big things.
Exactly. My next question, so going back to the Phronema, is how does having the correct Phronema affect how Orthodox Christians understand theology and approach issues within Orthodoxy, such as the scripture, liturgy, and the sacraments?
Okay, so the Phronema is like sort of what we were talking about just now. We don't look at these things as rules. Let's take something like sacraments or fasting or some other practices, ascetic practices. If you have an Orthodox Phronema, you're looking at this not as a rule or something on a checklist that must be an obligation to be met. That's Catholic. The Catholics will say you're obligated to go to church on this feast day, check, 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 And Protestants also have a kind of rule-based mentality. This is what you need to do. And so they just want to follow that. It's very linear. So you might hear Orthodox say, well, you have to fast from this or that, but they don't mean it in the sense that it's an obligation that somehow by fulfilling it, you've accomplished something. You accomplish nothing if you're doing it simply to fulfill an obligation. The whole point of going to church or fasting or saying your prayers or whatever is to transform yourself inwardly. Because if you just go through the motions and you treat it as an obligation to be fulfilled, you're not being changed by it. The point of all of these things, even just going to church, is to transform you. We should be trying to improve ourselves spiritually on a regular basis. But even that is tricky. We have to be so careful because we can know that and then be looking at ourselves. Am I any better than I was before? And we're actually not supposed to ask ourselves that question, because as soon as we say, yeah, I'm improving, I'm much better, you're opening yourself up to the sin of pride. You see, it's a very, very difficult, the spiritual walk is very difficult. It's not simple, and it cannot be reduced to a set of formulas or principles or rules to be followed. The Orthodox person understands that. And so the person with the right phronema understands that. So, for example, you'll have, it's very normal. I'm not trying to put anybody down by this. It's very normal that when you first come to the Orthodox faith, either as a cradle Orthodox who's just really rediscovering what it is to be Orthodox, or as a convert, it's very normal to want to do everything right. It's Lent and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this. And that's fine. Knock yourself out, okay? Just understand that the point is not completing those things like a task. You don't benefit from doing the thing itself. In other words, fasting is not a virtue. Patience is a virtue, generosity, humility, those are virtues. The fasting is supposed to teach us virtue, like self-control, but the fasting is not the end in itself. So unfortunately, too many Orthodox have this idea that that's the purpose or that's the end, it's accomplishing that thing as a goal, and then they don't benefit from it. So I can't remember what your question was about that. Okay, so I remember now. So I was going to say, you might have elderly people in the parish or people who are cradle Orthodox, and this is why it's very useful to have people, pious people, not just cultural Orthodox people, but pious Orthodox people, usually the elderly. And you might say, oh, you know, I went to this store and they had meatballs, for a sample, and I tried one and I forgot it was Friday and whatever. And that person saying, that's okay, don't worry about it. They'll have this very relaxed attitude. The real Orthodox Phronema is relaxed. It's not a state of anxiety. That's when you know you have, not relaxed, I don't have to worry about it, I'm not going to do anything. But relax in terms of understanding that you're always going to fail, but you keep on trying. And not beating yourself up when you don't do everything perfectly. So we don't get points for that. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, 100%. And it's sort of, it hammers home the point that we're not perfect ourselves. You know,
that's right, exactly.
Yeah.
So we don't try, but we do try, but we have to accept the fact that we're going to mess up, we're going to fail sometimes, and we just say, Lord, I'm sorry, I'm going to try harder next time. I'll try again. And the fact is that we achieve the kingdom of heaven through the struggle, not by achieving some level of perfection. If we say, I'm going to fast perfectly during Lent, I'm just going to have bread and water, and I'm never going to violate the fast, and I'm never going to do this. And then you finish the fast, even if you manage to do that, and you say, boy, I did a great job with the fasting, you've kind of missed the point of it, and you haven't really gained anything from it. But if you try and you fail and you get up and try again and you try again, the real victory is in the struggle. It's in the continued struggle. They say as often, there's a line in the prayer on Holy Wednesday that I love. It says, as often as you fall, rise again and you will be saved. That's the line. That's the Orthodox mentality.
It's not about, you know, like you said, attaining that level of perfection. It's about your attitude and what you do after you stumble. It's the analogy of the child who is on their bike and they've taken off their stabilizers and they're pedaling along, and then they fall off their bike and they scrape their knee, and the dad's waiting with open arms. The child doesn't run away off into the woods, it runs straight into the Father's arms. And that should be our attitude when we stumble and fall. We should go directly into the arms of our Father.
That's right. And the fact is that we are actually wired to do that. Because if you think about a little child at about 1 year old, they start to walk. They've watched everybody else walking. They want to do that. And they're very, shaky at first, and they might take a couple of steps and then they'll fall down. But they never stop trying. They never say, well, I just can't do it. So we are actually wired to continue. But we get messages in our head. Who do you think you are? Why do you think you're doing this? What's the point of all of this? And so, and of course, on a spiritual level, those messages come from the devil. Who do you think you are? And why are you doing this? And you don't need to do that. All of that is a bunch of baloney. And this is all of this superstitious stuff. And, all you need to do is believe in Jesus Christ. Whatever it is, whatever the messages are that is telling us to not repent. You don't need to go to confession. You haven't really done anything wrong. I mean, how often have we all thought that? Don't worry about it. You haven't done anything you need to confess. Are you kidding me? As soon as you have that thought, you should know where it's coming from. So it's the struggle. And also in that struggle, not only do we learn the mercy of God, but we also hopefully can learn to have mercy on our fellow human beings. And that's what makes Orthodoxy also different from the West in the way we approach the struggles of other people. We view these things in a very non-judgmental way that the West is not used to, because the Western Phronema has been, it says in the Bible that if you are homosexual, that you're going to hell. Therefore, all people with homosexual tendencies, they're all going to hell. And so, of course, people reacted against that. And in Orthodoxy, we never took that approach. We never said, it's okay, don't worry about it. But we said, listen, if you have a same-sex attraction, you're going to have to fight against that. Just as if you have opposite sex attraction and your mind is going in that direction all the time and is leading you to sin in that way, you have to fight that. And if you have a mind that's thinking about alcohol or gambling, or you get angry easily, whatever it is, we're all sinners. We're all in the same boat, even though we have different issues that plague us. We're all struggling. And so the Orthodox Church has never had that harsh attitude toward people who are struggling with certain types of sins. And instead, it's always been extremely welcoming and forgiving, but it cannot say, it's okay, don't worry about it. It's not a sin. And that's where the West has felt they had to go. And that's because they have a very binary conception of it's either okay because we want to affirm that God loves you, or if we say that it's a sin, we're saying you're going to hell. No. That person might go to heaven, and I might go to hell. That person might go to heaven because they struggled. Maybe they felt a lot. But if I'm sitting here saying, I am an Orthodox Christian and I've lived a good life and therefore I deserve to go to heaven, I'm going to end up in hell. And this person who struggled with their passion may be the one who goes to heaven. You see what I mean? It's a very different mentality. That's the Orthodox Phronema. That's the Orthodox mind.
Yeah, exactly. And and that echoes precisely what Christ said.
That's right.
To us, pick up your cross and follow me. And what did he do with the cross? Right. He fell. He stumbled. He had to get someone else to help him. And that's what the church is. The church is that support.
That's right. He said that many will come from the east and the west and sit at the table of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, while the sons of the kingdom will be on the outside where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's why the Orthodox are, very reluctant to say who is saved and who is not saved, because there will be many surprises at the judgment. So Jesus was saying that the people who really believed that they're saved, like the first will be last and the last will be first, the people who are very confident in themselves, like the Pharisee in the parable of the publican and the Pharisee, those are the people who are likely to be left out of the kingdom of heaven. So we have to be constantly aware of our own sinfulness, not in a kind of a depressive way, oh, I'm a sinner, and not in a guilt-ridden way like the West does, but just in a realistic way that we're all sinners, all in need of healing.
Yeah, exactly. And, and for me, when I see, our society, and we all need healing from, as the Orthodox see sin as a disease, as an affliction, as a ailment that we need to be cleaned from. And I think that's a really refreshing way of looking at the concept of sin. And you see time and time again, people trying to push God away and
Yes.
push away Christ, and you know, like for instance with Jesus mythicism, you know, trying to even dismiss that he even existed in the first place, saying he was an
Yes.
invention of the Romans and things like that. And it just makes me so sad to see
Yes.
the world, even though I'm not surprised that the
Hmm.
world is like this. It
Yes.
it makes me so sad when, you know, it's like Florence Nightingale going up to
Mm.
the troops to help them and to help cure them, and you know, to give them
Yes.
medicines and things like that. Say, here, you know, take this medicine, it will heal, it will stop your pain, it will get rid of
Yes.
your suffering, you know. And the soldier's
Yes.
like, no, no, I don't want it, I
No,
don't
we don't
want
need
it,
that. Yes.
even though he's
Yes.
crying, he's practically ripping his arm off
Yes.
because he's in so much pain.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
what Christ is the medicine, and all
Mhm.
he's offered is love and acceptance and joy and
Right.
peace that
Right.
surpasses all understanding. And it just
Yes.
makes me so sad to see the world this way.
Well said. That one of the most common titles that we use, well, there's a couple ones that we use very often in the Orthodox Church when we speak about Christ or pray to Christ. We address him as the physician of our souls and bodies. That's who he is. So when we say, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy over and over, we're not saying it as he's judging us. Lord have mercy, don't strike us dead. It's not like that at all. We're like the blind man at the side of the road, or those other people who were suffering, and they would ask him, call on him, have mercy, help me. And that's what Christ is. He's the physician of our souls and bodies. And another title that we use often of him is philanthropos. And this is translated in a lot of different ways in English. The one who loves mankind. Sometimes lately I'm hearing the word benefactor, which I don't really care for as a translation. The lover of man, the one who loves mankind, the one who loves humanity. That term appears so often in the prayers of the Orthodox Church that Christ loves us and wants to heal us, and we will never feel peace. We think that what we really, really want is to follow our own desires and be left to our own devices and just sin as much as we want to. But we find that this ends up in emptiness and despair. And maybe this is what society is beginning to learn now, because you mentioned people that you think are coming to the Orthodox Church because they're tired of the capitulation and the compromises in other churches. And they really want something of, they want truth, and they want healing, and they want stability, and they'll find it in Orthodoxy, even though some Orthodox so-called theologians are trying to promote those other ideas.
Yeah.
Even in the church.
What I'd love to do is I'd love to bring in some questions that we've had come in from the live chat. So believe it or not, my father's watching, and he's so he's taken an interest in, you know, me seeking out
Nice.
orthodoxy and things like that, and is actively trying to understand the Orthodox way of thinking and things like that. And
yes.
you know, I find that very admirable.
It is.
I love that
And he
about my
loves
dad.
you, which is
And
beautiful.
he's grown up in the church. His church is my grandfather was a minister, and he had a sort of high middle church mentality, sort of like not quite
Yes.
high church, but sort of high middle.
Yes.
A wonderful man. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. So he's
we used to have a lot in common with the Anglicans and the Episcopalians. You know, when I was growing up, we were told that if you're living someplace or you're on vacation somewhere where there is no Orthodox church, go to an Episcopalian church. Because at that time, they were very close to us, except for the papacy, right? But once they started ordaining women and all these other things now, it's quite different. But there's a lot, you know, of respect that the Orthodox always had. We were very sorry to see the direction in which the Anglicans, you know, went, because it was such a lost opportunity for return to the ancient faith, which you guys had a portion of because of your history and many beautiful traditions.
Mm.
You know.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. So he's asked two questions. So the first one is a question saying, so would it be fair to say that Orthodoxy is about getting back to true basics of Christianity through the inerrancy of the Bible without the accretions of the ages, which some see as distractions?
Yes. I think what's your dad's name?
Will.
Will. Hi, Will. I think that Orthodoxy isn't about getting back to. It's that we never left it. And that's the difference between us and some other Protestant movements that have sprung up since the Reformation, that we never departed. And here's what happened. I don't think we really explained this particularly well or at all, that what happened was in the Latin West, when you have, for example, you had popes sending missionaries up to Canterbury and Kent in England, somebody like Gregory the Great back in the early 600s, and reestablishing the church in England, all of Western Europe came under the papacy. And the papacy and the Latin church developed a very different way of theologizing, a very different mentality about sin and about salvation that was specifically Latin, medieval, and Catholic. And the Orthodox Church never developed those ways of thinking. The Orthodox Church just continued with this ancient idea of a holistic view of the person. They never developed this idea of you're tainted by original sin. You have an evil human nature, this kind of thing. Orthodoxy never had that. So we're not trying to go back to something. We're just keeping what we never lost. The Catholic Church developed a very different mentality about sin and salvation. And of course, the papacy was a big part of that. And then the Anglican Communion came out of that. And then the Protestant Reformation came out of that. So they have the same ideas about sin and salvation and many other basic concepts like original sin that were never part of the early church. So it's not really getting back to, it's just keeping what we never lost.
I think,
and
yeah, I was just going to say that what I sort of imagine Orthodoxy being, if you could sort of label it in one sort of umbrella term, is sacred preservation, of preserving everything the way it was originally delivered right the way through to now.
That's right. But what happens is, my experience has been that people don't really respect that. And there's two reasons why I think people don't respect that. First of all, they think that their ideas are superior. In other words, whatever we think is right in our own heads, we almost never tell ourselves we're wrong. We just believe that whatever thoughts come into our heads are wonderful and correct. So people either don't believe that, or secondly, they don't believe it because they've never experienced it. And I've come to this understanding recently that the West has never experienced this changelessness of orthodoxy, that it's just part of our life. We know that we're doing the same exact liturgy, the same exact prayers, the same exact practices. We're reading the same kinds of books that people read in the 4th century. Not that we don't have anything else, but that's pretty much those are the favorites. So those are the favorite things. Okay, so that means that there's a consistency in orthodoxy. And the West has never experienced that, so they don't value it. And I think they don't believe that we have it. Do you see what I mean? So I think that that's part of the reason why they just is meaningless to them.
Yes.
Other question from Will.
Yes. Can you explain the importance of iconography within Orthodoxy?
Okay, so iconography, I'll tell you what people usually say about it. Why is it important? Of course, the first thing that we think about in terms of iconography is the beautification of the church. And even though that is extremely important, aesthetics are very important in Orthodoxy, not simply because there's an appreciation for beauty, which is a very Greek thing, by the way. It's because the church is an expression of the kingdom of God, and it ought to be beautiful, and the music ought to be beautiful. And when we're in church, especially in these churches which are covered with icons all over the place, we feel that we're in the presence of the saints and the angels and Christ when we worship. So it expresses profound theological truths. Of course, it inspires us. And it's also a way that, of course, traditionally, when people didn't have books available, they were able to look at the icons and be reminded of the stories and things like this. So it's an important part of Orthodoxy because it expresses who we are. And one of the ways that we see even that Orthodox tradition there is that you're going to see the same basic scheme in every Orthodox church. And you're going to see icons that look just like an icon that was painted 1,000 years ago, because it's not dependent upon a person's imagination. Nobody says, I'm going to imagine Jesus looking like this, and then they paint him whatever way they imagine him. We don't value that. What we value is, this is how we paint Christ. Why? Because everything in an icon has theological meaning. It's a language unto itself. So if you change a detail in it, you're changing the theology. So everything has meaning in an Orthodox church, and it's pretty profound meanings too, you know. So that's the importance of iconography. Not that we worship the icons, but that they express the presence of the saints, the angels, Mother of God, Christ, of course, and that it expresses also the theology of the church.
Mm. Yeah, they're often described within Orthodoxy as windows into heaven, which I absolutely adore that phrase of, you know, just catching a glimpse. Like, you don't look at the glass of a window, you look through the window to the outside world.
Yes. That's why the icons are spiritual, and they exude a spirituality that is something. That's why they look so different, and people think they look odd. But the people, even though we recognize them, I mean, if you look at an icon of Chrysostom, it's always Chrysostom. You recognize him. It's always Nicholas and Demetrius, you know, Catherine. We recognize them. The faces are the same, but there's a common aspect of them that shows the spirituality of the person. They're not laughing. They're not smiling. They're not, hey, they're not trying to look. We smile so that we will look more attractive. They don't care about that. They're serious because this is serious stuff. They have their hand in a gesture. You know, if a woman has her hand like this, she's a, you know, virgin martyr. If the man is like this, he's a priest or a bishop. And so everything in the icon is expressing a reality about the spiritual life. And that's really important because they're not just decoration.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, love it. So I'd love to talk briefly about the Crucifixion of the King of Glory.
Yes, sir.
That is a book that has genuinely touched my life in a very positive way. It is profound, it is deep, it is mind-blowing in places. When you started you know, to deal with this topic, like how long does a book like that take to prepare? If you could put a time on that.
Well, it's interesting because I wrote it because my sister, who I dedicated the book to, was telling me, you know, you really have to write this down, because for many, many years, since I was really a newlywed, when Father had his first parish, I was giving talks about the crucifixion just to explain what it was like, what life was like. But what you can give, even in a couple of hours or 3 hours or 4 hours, is just very small amount of information. But I had done it so much for so many years, and people were saying to me, do you have a book about this? Because they found it very interesting. And I said, no. And finally, my sister said, you just have to write this down in a book. So I sat down and I wrote everything out. And it took me a month. And then I looked at it and I said, this is really boring. I didn't know, because it was information. When you deliver it orally, it can be dynamic and interesting. And it's not that it wouldn't have been somewhat interesting, but it wasn't compelling. So I said to myself, why would anybody read this book? It's not like, maybe if you want some information about what crucifixion is like, fine, but that's just not a reason. Everybody knows what happened to Jesus. How do I really present this in a way that people will want to read it? Because unless you're looking to give a lecture and so you want information about the technique behind crucifixion, for example, you have no reason to read this book. So I sat on it for a while, and I thought about how am I going to present this as a story in a way that will bring the reader along and make them feel like they're there, that they're looking through the little crack in the door to see what was happening behind the scenes. And so it took me a long time to figure out how to do that and to present it in a way that was very different than thinking Orthodox. That's short chapters, moving the story along, trying to weave the information into the story so that you're learning, but you don't really realize you're learning, hopefully. Like Jesus cleanses the temple, and then you kind of learn about what the temple was really like, that kind of a thing. So I think that's the best kind of teaching when you're teaching, because you're being enveloped into the story. So that took a while. And then, of course, there were many questions, a lot of things I already knew. So a big part of it, maybe a third of it, I had already written. But now it was a question of how I'm going to present it in an effective manner. But in addition to that, there was a lot of research and also I had written another one of my degrees from Harvard was about Roman law. So I had that, a lot of that. I was able to use I was happy to be able to use a lot of that information when I got to Pilate. So it took a couple of years, I would say, of real study. And it also, one of the nice things about writing, especially a book like that, is I had my own questions about things that I wondered about that I never could understand. I wasn't quite sure, why did this happen the way it did? So why was this so important? And those questions I was able to answer for myself in my own research. And so that was very gratifying. And just to know that people find it something that, that is meaningful to them, especially during Lent as they get ready for Holy Week, is a wonderful thing. One of the things that is useful to remember from that book is this, that the Gospels are very short, very, very short. It says, they brought Jesus to Golgotha, he was carrying his cross, and Simon of Cyrene, and they stripped him of his clothes, and they offered him some, wine mixed with gall, and then they crucified him. We feel like we know the story because we've heard those gospel accounts so often, but it's so brief. It really doesn't teach us very much. And that's because everybody, when the gospels were written, they assumed that everybody knew what it was like. They didn't have to describe it. That's how we should think about tradition. Everything I brought out in the book to describe what crucifixion was really like, I had to find from research, right? And then present it to you. But tradition is what is in the church, and the church never lost. The church didn't keep that kind of historical stuff. You see what I mean? But it's important for us to remember that the Gospels have those limitations. And the limitation is, unless you understand the lifestyle of the time, unless you understand the thought process, the Phronema of the early church, you're not going to understand what it's telling you, unless you understand the temple and first century Judaism and what the Jewish high priesthood was like. You're not going to understand it. They didn't have to explain that to the people who read the Gospels because everybody knew it. right?
Yeah.
It's that background information that we needed.
Yeah. And we take that for granted now,
Yes.
because we, it is because we have been numb to it, because, we are part of, for better or for worse, we have been brought up within a Christian valued society, a Christian foundational society, whether that's the UK or the US,
Yes.
or even Europe, all Christian foundations. And as part of that, you have Easter and things like that. Yes, it's been, decorated with Easter eggs and bunnies and things like that now. But, fundamentally, people know it's about Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, but they don't know why it's significant. How, the verse that I usually bring to a Muslim, where they say, "Oh, Jesus never said never said he was God," is Mark 14 verses 60 to 64, where he's before Caiaphas, and Caiaphas says, "I implore you, tell us if you are the son of God." He says, "I am, and you will see me coming on the clouds of heaven." Yeah, exactly. And you explain it so well, and you say there's a clear distinction that's made between, he's not claiming to be a son of God, he's claiming to be the Son of God.
Son of God.
He used the double theological shotgun to both barrels of the "I am" statement and the Son of Man statement.
Yes, the I am, identifying himself as the I am. And he, of course, how many times in the Gospel of John, before Abraham ever was, I am, he said. So only God pre-existed or always existed, right? So I know that that's what Muslims say, but they don't know the New Testament. It's unfortunate. So many Christians can't even give that kind of an answer to say how we know that Jesus claimed to be God. And the first, and not only did he claim it at his trial, it's the reason why they put him to death.
Yeah, it's the reason why Caiaphas tore his robes.
Exactly. That's right. It's like these uttered blasphemy. We don't need witnesses anymore. I mean, that's the reason. So it's not just Muslims who say that, but there are other people in the society who say, "Oh, Jesus never claimed to be God." I say, "Oh, yeah, why did they put him to death?" That's exactly why. And then they actually affirmed that to Pilate in the Gospel of John, where we don't have the Jewish trial. In the Gospel of John, Pilate is kind of hemming and hawing, is trying not to execute Jesus because he really hasn't committed a crime. And then they say, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, for he made himself the Son of God." And now Pilate's all really nervous about it. So, I mean, that's the reason why Jesus was put to death. There was no other reason except on the charge of blasphemy. So, yep, he did claim it.
Yep.
And of course, in many other ways, more subtle, right? When he said, "I have authority on earth to forgive sins," the Son of Man will come and judge the world. And all of these things are claims of divinity, but we don't think about it.
Yeah. I mean, like you said in your book, he alluded to it many times, but here he explicitly stated it.
Yes. And why did he explicitly state it? I will turn the tables and ask you a question.
Because he explicitly states it because he has been placed under a legal binding statement to proclaim his divinity, but also he knows what's going to happen. It's all inevitable.
He's been put under oath, and that's why he finally answers the question. But I think what you were getting at also, secondly, is that he is now testifying to Pilate, not to Pilate and to Caiaphas, the truth of who he is. They cannot say, "I didn't know." Just like Judas could never say, "It's not my fault, I didn't know who he was," because he told the disciples who he was, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. So, nobody is in the dark. They might not accept it or believe it, but they can't say he never told us that. So he does acknowledge that, and it is because of that. It was important for him to acknowledge that explicitly. So he does.
Yes, exactly. And that's what I love about this book specifically, is because you sort of intersperse the explicit readings of the text with these sort of like these lived-in sort of conversations that happen, what they were really saying in the way that we would say it
Yes.
now, and that helps us relate even more to the text.
Yes. Right. I'm glad. Yeah, it's interesting how some of this, if you really stand back and because so many people have said that, for example, the portrayal of Pilate was not accurate, because we know from history that Pilate was a very brutal guy. Okay, he put a lot of people to death. And so because of this, so many Bible scholars just say, oh, this is the church trying to put responsibility for Jesus's death on the Jews. Pilate was a brutal guy. He wouldn't have hesitated to put Jesus to death. But I don't agree with that. No. And I think I make a very good case for why that assumption is wrong, and why Pilate really was afraid to put Jesus to death.
Yeah.
He had good reason to be afraid to put Jesus to death. Yeah. And it's so obvious that that's exactly what the story is getting at. But because we're living 2,000 years later, we don't really understand the nuance behind the story. That Pilate, it never occurs to us to think that Pilate might, as a normal Roman of his time, believe that Jesus was one of the gods from Olympus in disguise, because Jesus doesn't act like any defendant who ever appeared before Pilate. He's completely calm. He's not afraid. He's not intimidated. He's not nervous. He's not asking for counsel. He's not offering a bribe. He's doing none of the things that any other defendant would be doing. And so Pilate is completely unnerved by this. And when you look at it, it's so obvious. That tells us that the Gospels are accurate. So all those people who are saying that that's not how it really was, they're all wrong, totally wrong. But they're wrong because they're analyzing it with the phronema of a 20th or 21st century person. They're not getting into the mind of a person of the first century. And that's why phronema is important. So when we're studying the Bible, we will never understand the New Testament if we come to it with the mentality, the presumptions, the legal sort of rationalistic understandings or explanations of a person of our time. We have to understand it through the eyes of the early church. That's where the fathers come in. The fathers help steer us back there, because the fathers never lost that understanding. The fathers, the church, just think about this. When Jesus said certain things, those things were passed along in the early church, did people remember what they meant? Of course they remembered what was the traditional understanding of something like the kingdom of heaven suffers violence. Bible scholars have no idea what to do with that. Okay, in the Orthodox Church, we know exactly what that means, because that explanation or the interpretation of a psalm or something else that the Lord said was passed along orally in the church. And it shows up in all the different writings of the fathers, the early fathers, the middle fathers, the later fathers. And we all know it because it's all there. And so that's why we have confidence in these things. That's why we have confidence in tradition, because it's not that these things were explained and then everybody forgot. And then all of a sudden, hundreds of years later, we're trying to figure it out. There has been a consistency, a consistent tradition, a consistent teaching, a consistent interpretation that just keeps getting repeated throughout history. And that's what Orthodoxy has preserved. And the rest of the Christians don't get it because they have never experienced that. They don't believe it.
It's an organic way of life and an organic worship.
That's right.
It's living. It's breathing.
But a lot of it is just so simple. But they never think to ask the question or to approach it from a different perspective, because everything comes down to what makes sense to me in my rational mind. And I will give you an example of this. An example of this is modern Bible scholars who will say that St. Paul only actually wrote 7 books that are attributed to him. And Among them is First Thessalonians, but many Bible scholars do not believe that Paul wrote Second Thessalonians. Now, I won't get into the reasons why they don't believe that he wrote Second Thessalonians, but here's my point, that in the early church, let's say the first century, after Paul dies as a martyr, we know that one of the first things that happened is that people began to gather his letters. And they did this, of course, in a very informal way. Somebody might be traveling to Thessalonica from Corinth, and they meet somebody, they meet a Christian, and say, oh, we have a couple of letters from Paul. I will send you a couple copies from ours. I want to make a copy of yours, what you have, while I'm here, and I'll take it back. And that's how it happened in a very, like you said, organic, very informal manner. Well, we think by the end of the first century, maybe early second century, already the epistles of Paul, whatever remained, were gathered together by these different communities. Think about that, especially the communities that had Paul as a founder. He was very important to them. It's like if you have a spiritual father, he leaves you something very important, a prayer rope or something, you're going to hold on to that. That's important to you. It's a treasure. So this is now still early church, let's say second century. And the tradition was that Paul wrote these 13 epistles. I'm not counting Hebrews. That's a different question. So now, think about the fact that today, hundreds of years later, scholars will say Paul never wrote Second Thessalonians, but he wrote First Thessalonians. Now, in the early church, let's say it's the year 150, do you think that they knew which letters Paul actually wrote or not? The reason why modern Bible scholars will come to these conclusions is because they forget that there was a church there, okay? And by the way, it's still there in Thessalonica, that Paul established. And they probably had his original letters in their possession as late as 150. You understand what I'm saying? So if there was a spurious document that was included in this collection, there's a church there at Thessalonica which would have said, oh, no, we don't have 2 letters from Paul. He only wrote us 1. So there's a conclusion that they're making based on their suppositions, which exclude any concept of a continuing church that was the original church that received those letters, that had a relationship with Paul, people that he baptized. There were people in that congregation in the mid-second century who knew him personally, or who were the children of people who knew Paul personally. You understand what I'm trying to say? So there's this real connection. And Bible scholars will say, oh, we're going to analyze this, we analyze that, we analyze that. Oh, Paul never wrote it. Are you kidding me? Do you think, and this is the other thing that they will say, well, people accepted these spurious, sort of apocryphal writings, or, there were writings in the name of Paul. No, they didn't. There's no evidence that the church ever accepted fake apostolic writings. As a matter of fact, they were very sensitive to the fact that writings could be falsified, and they rejected fake apostolic documents. Otherwise, we would have the proto-evangelium of James in the New Testament, and it never appears on anybody's list. So this idea that we can decide from our perspective what the early church knew, and what, rather than taking that seriously, why don't they take seriously the fact that the early church never, ever suggested that any of those epistles was not by Paul? They're all accepted as Pauline. Why doesn't that count for anything? Because they believe their own opinions, their own analysis, their own logic to be superior to what the early church knew and what the early church believed. And the early church is so much closer to the time of Paul. And they really cared about it too. This idea that, oh, we're just going to accept these writings. Somebody said it was by Paul. Oh, we never knew about this letter, but I guess he really wrote another one that we have no knowledge of. This church didn't cease to exist. You understand what I'm trying to say? That's the attitude that we're dealing with here. And so Orthodoxy takes those things very seriously. That's what we mean by tradition. It's not just practicing little cutesy, sign of the cross or icons or anything. Tradition means you have a living community that received this knowledge, and that knowledge was preserved, and you respect that because it's true. Why is there a presumption that it's not true? Because people think they're smarter than everybody who ever lived in antiquity, because they didn't have electricity and technology and Zoom.
Great stuff. I'd love to ask you, because there's one question that sort of gets thrown around a lot.
Okay.
And that's the schism. Okay. Big
Yes.
Big thing that happened. Okay. We have the one Holy Catholic Apostolic Church, right?
Right.
In the beginning, Christ established, right?
Yes.
Jobs are good on.
Yes.
And then things started to happen. Things started to get introduced and things like that. And then the church is split. So what actually happened at the split? For those who don't know, for those who might be interested to find out from an Orthodox perspective, what happened at the schism? What caused the schism?
All right. Well, the schism was a gradual separation between East and West that had a lot to do with language and culture. The West spoke Latin, and by West we mean Western Roman Empire. We mean Italy, Spain, Gaul, Britain, Ireland, and North Africa. That's West. The East is Greece, Asia Minor, Palestine, and Egypt. That's Greek-speaking part of the Roman Empire. So what happened, now there wasn't a tremendous difference between the beliefs of the Christians in the East and the West, but then Augustine came along, and Augustine introduced something brand new. And what Augustine introduced was an entirely different way of theologizing. That is, that he decided, because he was not a trained theologian or a trained Bible scholar, he was a philosopher, he was a teacher of rhetoric. He said that when he would try to answer a theological question, he didn't know the answer, he would just apply his powers of reasoning. And he believed that whatever answer he arrived at was correct because God gave human beings reason and God is the source of all truth. Therefore, if we follow our human reasoning and apply it correctly, we will always arrive at the truth. Well, that was Augustine's contribution. And if you've ever read any of Augustine and his theological treatise, he analyzes and asks a question, it gets an answer, and asks another question, gets another answer, and that's another question, gets another answer. It is very tedious, very analytical. That was a departure from how the church had always theologized. The church always theologized according to the fishermen. That is, they followed apostolic tradition. The early church never felt the need to explain things, analyze them, give rational explanations for things. So when Augustine introduced that methodology, because he wrote so many books, he was the most prolific father in the Latin church, and everybody read Latin. People were influenced by his thoughts, his ideas, some of his teachings, which were a bit different, but especially his methodology. And so eventually that crept into the Western church, the Latin-speaking side of the church, in which everything was, the theology was done by analysis, by human reasoning, asking questions, getting answers. And this is why you have those proverbial discussions in the Middle Ages, how many angels can fit on the head of a pin, and all kinds of speculative questions in which people really enjoyed the mental gymnastics of theology. That's not the early church. Theology is about one thing. It's about talking about God. And in the East, they only discussed what was necessary for our salvation. They would never venture into speculative theology because theology was never about showing how smart you are or how complicated your thoughts can be or how eloquent you can become. Do you understand what I'm saying? But this created two very different frameworks for how to theologize. At the same time, what was happening in the West is that after the fall of Rome, the bishops of Rome began to assert more and more authority. And they were the only major city with a major bishop that was in the West. So as the bishops of Rome, people like Gregory the Great sent out, missionaries to places like England and to places like, the Frankish kingdom and to Frisia and other places, into Gaul. They sent out missionaries. Those missionaries looked to Rome always as their leader. Whereas in the East, you had all kinds of population. Now remember, they had to evangelize Western Europe. They didn't have big cities in Western Europe. The centers of population, the places of culture and education were in the East, in Athens, Thessalonica, Constantinople, Ephesus, Caesarea Palestine, Caesarea Cappadocia, Alexandria, Antioch. That's where the population was in the East. That's where education was. That's where learning was, not in Western Europe. You had barbarian tribes and very wild living people in Western Europe in the early parts of the Middle Ages. So as the Western Church developed, it developed very differently from the East. And early on, those differences began to be noticed, but not very early, around the years of Photios the Great, around the year of the 900s and the 800s and 900s, it came to the awareness of the East that the West was teaching things that were contrary to the tradition of the church, and that the popes were insisting on more power and authority than the early church originally ever allotted to them. But the popes believed their own press. And by the way, every pope added more and more and more papal claims. So by the time of the Great Schism, there had already been little minor skirmishes over things like the filioque, the statement that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. That came from Augustine, but it was added in the Latin Church, especially the Frankish kingdom promoted that. And over the use of unleavened bread, that wasn't the early church tradition, even though everybody assumes it's a Passover meal. Jesus used leavened bread. I talked about that in the book, that the Bible, the New Testament, speaks of leavened bread, not unleavened bread. So, whether or not he did that, you can believe what you want. But those were some of the things that they were disputing between East and West. It only became an actual schism, actually not in 1054, but at a period of time a little bit later. But I'll talk about what happened in 1054. In 1054, you see, there were still Greek speakers in southern Italy, all over the coast of southern Italy, in places like Sicily and in the heel of Italy. Those were all Greek speakers. The Greeks had established colonies all over the Mediterranean from the hundreds of years before Christ. So those Greek Christians used to worship and have the divine liturgy of St. John Chrysostom in Greek. They weren't following Latin rites. But the Latins always had a tendency to try to get everybody to conform to whatever Rome was doing. So the Bishop of Rome, and he's very close by, being in the boot of Italy, the Bishop of Rome tried to force all of the Greek Christians to conform to Roman rites and use Latin. And they got upset about that. So meanwhile, the Patriarch of Constantinople, the Archbishop of Constantinople, turned around and, as a tit-for-tat move, forced all of the Latin Christians, because there were some Latin parishes in Constantinople, to use the Greek rite. So this set off this kind of a little skirmish between the two. So the Pope of Rome, his name was Nicholas, sent a couple of papal legates to Constantinople to sort of smooth things over. And they really should have gone back to the way they were. Let the Latins use Latin in Constantinople, let the Greeks in Italy use Greek. So the papal legates, the most famous one his name was Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida. So he gets to Constantinople, and he's warmly received by the emperor. This is still when there's a Byzantine Empire in Constantinople, of course. He's warmly received. He's a papal legate, so he's supposed to be treated like the Pope himself. He represents the Pope. Well, the ecumenical patriarch refuses to see him. And Humbert waits, and he waits, and he waits, and he waits, and weeks pass, and Ecumenical Patriarch refuses to even meet with him. Now, the reason why the Patriarch refused is because shortly after Humbert left Rome, the Pope was fighting with the Normans. You know, the popes used to lead armies in battle and everything because they had their own territory. So he was a prisoner of war of the Normans. And the Patriarch found out about this and before Humbert got there, and he suspected that Cardinal Humbert was a fraud. Remember, they had no way of knowing whether or not this person really is whom they claim to be. He figures these guys are fake. They're not real papal legates. I'm not going to meet with them. And another reason why he said that he concluded that Humbert was a fraud is because Humbert said a lot of things that were incorrect historically about the position of the Ecumenical Patriarch. For example, he said, you're not second in line after Rome. You have to come after Alexandria and after Antioch because those were Petrine sees. So Caroladios, Patriarch Michael of Constantinople, is saying, this guy is an idiot. He doesn't even know church history because he didn't know that that was the idea that they had in Rome about the Peter is in charge of the Pope is the head of the church because of Peter. I mean, he kind of knew that, but this distorted idea that Constantinople is last, not second, everybody knows it's second because of the canons of the church. So he figures, Patriarch Michael figures this guy's a fraud. So what happens is, meanwhile, while Cardinal Humbert and this other papal legate are in Constantinople, they are extremely upset by what they see. They see the use of leavened bread in the divine liturgy, which was always the practice in the East. I don't know if you understand why, but leavened bread, first of all, because there are two different words for, there's a different word used for bread in the New Testament, artos, and there's a different word used for unleavened bread. It's not like we have the word bread and then you add an adjective, unleavened bread. No, it's bread, is artos, that means leavened bread. And then there is azimi, which means unleavened. So if you read Exodus, it uses the word azymes, A-Z-Y-M-E-S, for unleavened bread used by the Jews. But when the scriptures describe Jesus taking bread and breaking it and saying, this is my body, it doesn't use that word. It uses the word artos, which is always leavened bread. And the church has always used leavened bread because it represents the resurrection. The yeast in the bread is alive and it rises. So that we have the sacrifice of Christ represented by the bread and also the resurrection there. So it was against the canons of the church to use unleavened bread because that was a denial of the resurrection. So Humbert does not know anything about this. He criticizes them. He sees that they're using leavened bread. He sees that priests have beards. This really bothered him. He saw that priests were married and he assumed that they were all just fornicating and living with women because in the West they were trying to enforce clerical celibacy. He sees all these other things that he associates in his mind with heresy and corruption. So he wrote a denunciation of the Patriarch Michael Kerularios and lists all of these terrible heresies that the Easterners were doing. So he anathematizes Kerularios and everybody who does these things or follows these practices. Well, that's the whole Christian East. He just assumed that the Patriarch and some of his entourage and some priests were corrupt. He didn't understand that that's the whole Christian East because the things that he denounced were Orthodox practice. So he takes this document because Kerularios refused to meet with him, goes to St. Sophia, in Constantinople, lays the bull of excommunication on the altar and storms out of there and goes back to Rome. Now, it was written in Latin, which practically nobody in Constantinople could read. So it took them a whole day to find somebody proficient enough in Latin to tell them what it said. Now, what did they do about that? Nothing. The next day, everything was as before because nobody took that action seriously. So it's, we look back in history and we choose an artificial date, say this is the date of the Great Schism, but it didn't change anything with the church. And it really shouldn't have. And here's why. Because at the time that he laid the bull of excommunication on the altar, the Pope had died as a prisoner of the Normans. That means that the actions of the papal legate are of nothing. Because you can't represent a dead person, okay? So the powers of Candelarius to excommunicate the powers of Cardinal Humbert to excommunicate the Patriarch or anybody else ceased to exist. But he was a very powerful person in Rome. And he went back home and he told everybody how terrible the Greeks were and how they're all corrupt and they're married or they're just living with women. I'm not sure what he said. So that is the date. Now, after him came another pope, a reformer pope, Gregory VII, at the end of that very same century, who insisted on even more powers of the papacy. And he's the one who said, the Pope can judge everyone and be judged by no one. That's Gregory VII in a list of sayings of the Pope called Dictatus Papae. So that's the kind of mentality that they had in the West. So you can understand that they're going to clash with the East. But still, there was actually no schism. Nothing changed in the way the East and the West related to each other after the Bull of Excommunication. What changed and caused true schism was the Fourth Crusade, when the Venetians came to Constantinople rather than going to Jerusalem. They conquered Constantinople, they sacked and burnt the city, they stole its treasures, they committed sacrilege in the churches, and installed a Latin patriarch on the throne of the ecumenical patriarch. And the Orthodox bishops fled the city and set up, their headquarters in Nicaea. Now you have true schism because there are two different bishops claiming to be the rightful Archbishop of Constantinople. And that was where the real schism happened. And that's what forever changed the relationship between the East and the West. And the Greeks still talk about it today. You know that, I'll just say this, that when Pope John Paul II visited Greece, and I think he was the first of all, the Greek church refused to welcome him as the head of the Catholic Church. He wanted to come to Greece and they wouldn't receive him. So he changed his tactic and came as a representative of the Vatican, as the head of state of the Vatican. And the Greek government welcomed the Pope to Greece, John Paul. This was, I think, in the 90s, John Paul II. And flags all over Greece were flying black, and everybody was extremely upset. And he apologized for the Fourth Crusade, which happened in 1204, by the way. So, the mentality of the people, we talk about tradition and what people remember, it's you can say it's kind of silly, but these things have a very lasting impact on a culture and on the mentality of a people. So he actually, I give him a lot of credit because the Fourth Crusade was not his fault. But 1204, the Fourth Crusade, is when there was an actual schism. And that because not only were there two bishops, but the two sides saw each other as enemies. That's what caused the schism.
Wow. I didn't know that. I was always been taught it's been 1054. But
yeah, that's a date that people give, but they look back at I think that's because there was an actual excommunication. There was no excommunication after the Fourth Crusade. I think it's because Cardinal Humbert excommunicated the East, and it's this dramatic moment, but actually it didn't impact the church at all. It's looking back, historians have a way of setting dates on things that actually took a long period of time to develop. You know what I mean? They're looking for some magic date so they can test their students.
Yes, exactly.
You would say 1054. I say 1054, but it's useful to realize that that in reality, that didn't change the relationship between East and West. It was the Fourth Crusades and the sack of Constantinople that changed the relationship between East and West.
It's 1054 with a wide berth.
Yes.
Right. So I think, I want to thank you very much for your time, for offering it so generously. And it's been an absolute delight to have you on. One final question from me. One's a bit of a smaller one, so I'll ask that one first. Do you have any more books coming out? Because I really want to read some more.
I was working on a sequel to The King of Glory, the Crucifixion on the Resurrection, which is very complicated. I was working on that very diligently. I have a father who's now 101 years old, and he's now in a care facility, but he fell down, he needed surgery, he's got dementia. He needs a lot of time. We had to go spend time with him. He was in facilities. He kept trying to escape, even though he broke his leg when he fell. And so I had to set that aside because that's going to be a real challenge. I'm very excited about it because I think it's going to be interesting. But that's going to be much more difficult than the Crucifixion book because the Crucifixion book had a very obvious story arc. You can start with this, like Jesus raising Lazarus, and you can go all the way through to him being buried in the grave. But the day of crucifixion, the day of resurrection, a lot of things are happening all at once. And it took me a long time to figure out how I'm going to tell that story in a way that's compelling. And I also want to weave in a lot of information that I hope will be interesting to people, just as with the Crucifixion book. And so I started that and I spent a lot of time on it, and I just didn't have the mental bandwidth because of my father's injuries and his own mental state. And so I started working on another book, which I hope will be out next year, which is more of a follow-up to Thinking Orthodox that I'm hoping people will really like. It's going to explain things in a different way, and also some of the questions that you were kind of getting at. What difference does it make that we have this phronema? How does it impact how we look at theological issues or moral questions? So I think that needs to be written, and I'm working on that right now.
Oh,
I wish I had more time to write, but I'm
that's fine.
Really
no, that's completely understandable, and I'm really sorry to hear about your.
Well, he'll be okay, but it's difficult, because your life is not really your own. You have a responsibility to spend time in these things, and people call you, and you have to arrange for certain kinds of care and things like this. So, but it's a wonderful thing to hear that you like the books, and I'm glad that you do, because that encourages me to keep at it. But it takes time to write a book.
I know.
If it's going to be a good book.
Yes, I will wait very patiently for it. As long as it takes, I will wait.
I could have published a lot of books if I just threw things together, because I have a lot of material, but I want them to be good. So that's the reason why they don't come out as often. I hear about people who put out a book every year, and I think, how do they do it? And I don't know if they have other people writing it. I don't know.
Have a team of researchers.
I don't know. But no, there are people who hire people, or they have, professors have students who help them. And I'm here by myself, looking things up and reading it. And it's not simply that I have to read it. I'll give you a little hint of what's going to be in the next book on the resurrection. One of the things I'm very fascinated by is the mirror bearers, who we know basically nothing about, practically nothing. We have some very interesting traditions about the mirror bearers, but we don't know a lot about them. I want to understand their lives. Who would they likely have been? What were their lives like? In order to do that, I have to understand more than just like daily life. I have to understand the legal status of women in Judaism. And you're entering a different world mentally, conceptually, and you have to begin to grasp an entirely different system of thought. And I have to read that. I have to read all the laws. I have to be able to analyze it, understand it, and then explain it. And that's why it takes a long time, because it's not easy. It's very time-consuming and mentally demanding.
But you do such a good job at it, though. I love it. love it.
Yeah, thank you. I think I like it. It's very fascinating.
Yeah.
I hope you like the next one as well.
Yes. And so the final question is,
Yes,
what
sir.
advice would you give to young potential scholars or individuals who are interested in pursuing a career in theology or biblical studies, like some of the things you've learnt the hard way that you wish people could not do and it'll save them pain and things like that?
Well, I think you, first of all, do what you can where you are. Sometimes, especially if you're a woman, we don't have a lot of options. If you also, as a man, let's say you're very interested in theology, let's say you want to have a career in theology, you have to get a PhD. There's no way around that. You have to have a PhD if you're going to teach or be any kind of a credible voice. It doesn't mean that because you have a PhD, you're smarter or you're trustworthy. You can have a PhD and be completely wrong. But that's kind of the standard in society. So that takes a long time. And it's very difficult to do. Most people who get their PhDs are already working. They have elderly parents, they have children, they have wives or husbands. And it's a process that takes many years and it's difficult to do. You have to be absolutely dedicated to finishing it and just determined that you're going to finish no matter what. And so that takes a lot of dedication and a lot of sacrifice on the part of the family too. So if you're going to do that, first of all, if you have to take courses, it's not the same in Europe as it is in the United States. Very often they require certain courses. Don't try to go to school full-time and work full-time. Take one course. Take maybe two courses and slowly work your way through it because it's a big strain on the family. I mean, there's no point getting a PhD in theology and ending up divorced, because you've strained the family finances or you're under a lot of stress and, your wife needs you or your husband needs your attention. So you have to balance those things very carefully. So I only went to school full-time after I was married. I only went to school full-time. Well, I did in law school. I was in school full-time, but I didn't have any children. For the theology, subsequent theology degrees, only one semester was I full-time because it was such a strain on everybody else because, you have to study, you have to write papers. So do what you can and be patient. If you want to be an Orthodox theologian, you have to have an Orthodox degree. You need to go to an Orthodox school of theology. If you want credibility as an Orthodox theologian, otherwise you haven't studied Orthodoxy. And I would say that if you want to be taken seriously, you want something that's mainstream, not some of these little institutes that are kind of popping up that are promoting these, like you said, progressive ideas. That's not Orthodoxy. So you also have to realize that it's very difficult to get any kind of a job in academia. So you need to be prepared to be able to do something else for a living because a lot of people get their PhD and then they can't get a job. So don't go into debt for your PhD, just assuming that because you have a PhD from Harvard or Yale or Cambridge or Oxford, you're going to get a job. You might not. And so study it, do it if you love it. But we could always use more, devoted Orthodox Christians in different fields of theology. So I'm encouraging you to do it, but just understand that it's something that takes time. I appreciate you asking me the question because I've had people, sometimes young women, say to me, I want to study theology and I have 3 kids. And I said, forget about it. Just read. You don't have to go to school. By the time I got to Holy Cross, the first Orthodox institution I attended, I already knew a lot because I had done a lot of reading. So you can do that at home. You don't have to do it as part of a, degree program, and that will help you. Read the fathers, read books of theology, read the scriptures, go to church, have a prayer life, live the Orthodox life. There's no such thing as an academic Orthodox theologian. To is truly an Orthodox theologian, you have to be living the life too. Get immersed in the life of the church. that's just as important as studying theology academically. And when you are in a phase in your life where you can take courses and work on a dissertation or something of that nature, then you go about doing it in that way. But we can't all do everything at one time. So you just do what you can. And, if it's of God, God will open the way and make it possible for you to continue your studies. And then always remember who you are and your place in the church. And our role is we're theologians in the church, not to show off, not to be, the authority in a parish, not to correct the priest or the bishop or anything else, not to be a know-it-all, but to write and podcast and speak and conduct Bible studies or answer questions, to be a resource that's of use in the church. But people who just read a few books and then they're spouting off on orthodoxy on the internet or at church are very misguided. And I know that people usually think that they know more than they actually do. But it's like any other profession. You go to the doctor and say, "Doctor, what's wrong?" He says, "Well, you're missing this enzyme and this is what happened." Well, he describes the enzyme to you, but there's like 14 steps the body is going through to get to that enzyme. And then there's another 15 steps after. It's much more complicated than you understand. So simply because you've read a few things does not mean you're in a position to be speaking about theology, and certainly not to be giving people spiritual advice. So they have to be very careful, because there are a lot of dangers in theologizing. And I address that, of course, in the Thinking Orthodox book. That's one reason why it's there, because of the dangers of people who presume to do theology when really they have no business theologizing. Or it's a fraught with dangers, we could say. Because for us, going back to how we first began, it's not an intellectual pursuit. It's a spiritual endeavor.
Exactly. Amen to that. Well, thank you, Dr. Constantinou, for your time.
It's my pleasure.
And for coming on. I'd love to have you on again to discuss something even more in depth and brilliant, stuff like that. But yes, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for watching. God bless you. Do tune in next time, where we will be having a discussion with William Albright on the, why the apostolic faith. So that will be next week at at 11 o'clock next week. But thank you, Dr. Constantinou. God bless you. And
thank you.
See you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Good night to all of your audience. Good night, Sam. Good night to your father.